The sinking of the Bismark. There was nothing about the inclusion of the Bismarck Theatre in Chicago that would suggest anything out of the ordinary. Sure, it was in a big American city, but it wasn't a venue we'd heard of before, and there was nothing about Chicago for us that had that gotta go there vibe to it. Well, not for me anyway. In fact, the biggest buzz about going to Chicago was the hotel where we were due to stay, and we knew nothing of that until we actually got there. We checked into the Ambassador East, a hotel that dates back to 1926 and Chicago's infamous past of gangsters, bootleggers, and machine gun massacres. The bar of the hotel was adorned with photographs of the famous people who'd stayed there. When I say famous, I mean proper famous, not rag asses like us. The real Frankie had stayed there. Sinatra's portrait was just one of many around the bar. It was like a who's who of Hollywood. I believe it's also the hotel where Phil Collins got his No Jacket Required album title from when he was refused entry from the hotel's restaurant, the Pump Room. He returned wearing a jacket, but it was inside out. What a wag. Interesting that this must have happened around the same time as we were there, because we were crossing paths with Phil Collins in a few hotels, and both ourselves and his bands had been hanging around US immigration at the same time, crossing the border from Canada. I spent 5 minutes in a lift with him in a hotel somewhere in the US, and despite being a huge Genesis fan, I bottled it and kept my mouth shut. He would have been playing the Enormodome somewhere in Chicago, but we were playing the humble Bismarck Theatre. It was an old movie theatre built on the back of the Bismarck Hotel, and, in years gone past, it would have been a very glamorous place. Just prior to our arrival, it had been converted into a rock venue. The seating had been removed and the orchestra pit had been covered over. We'd find out, before the night was over, that the job of covering the orchestra pit had not been a very good one. We took to the stage and I noticed straight away that something didn't look right. The stage was only about 4 feet high and it looked like the crowd was sloping downhill from the front of the stage. We played 2 songs and then got word from the side that something was up and we had to stop the show. There were mumbled reports about the floor collapsing, and it was only after 10 minutes that we were informed that some of the huge railway sleepers that had been slung across the orchestra pit to cover it had given way, and the only thing that was holding up the audience above it was the carpet. We're left in a state of confusion whilst all and sundry are running about trying to decide what to do. The gig's got to be cancelled. No, it doesn't. Someone could get hurt. We could get sued from the venue. We could be fucking sued from the band and the management. This was all detail as far as we were concerned, and we wanted to play. The fire department had to be called to evaluate the safety situation. All this seems to be taking way too long, and the fans outside are getting more and more restless as none of this information is being filtered through to them. The fire department, after much discussion with the band's management, the venue's management and the promoter, decide that the show can go ahead, but only if there are safety barriers erected 30 metres from the stage and the whole of the arena floor in front of the stage is cleared. This would mean that about 600 people would have to leave the venue. Some people have already left as over 30 minutes has expired since we left the stage, but others would need to follow or be ushered upstairs to stand at the back. Somehow, we meet the fire department's demands and it's announced that the show will continue in 5 minutes. We'd stopped the gig after 2 songs and the third song of our set was Relax. It was decided, in the interests of public safety, that to go out and play our one US hit straight after a delay of almost an hour could induce the small amount of people still standing downstairs to rush the stage, so word was sent to aid that the set was being changed. When we walk back out, I've never seen a more surreal scene in a theatre. We look across this huge carpeted floor to see a line of fire marshals standing in front of wooden barriers holding axes. What were the axes for? To behead any keen bean who fancied bopping on the dangerous floor. We turned in an absolutely supercharged performance to make sure our enthusiasm bridged the divide between the stage and the firemen. The people in the balcony were going nuts, and on stage we were joining them. The delay had seemed to hype the crowd more than diffuse it. It was an epic show. My abiding memory of the gig was looking across the carpet and seeing one solitary lady's shoe in the middle. I wonder what happened to the owner. Did she leave with the 600 and hop home, or was she dancing her ass off upstairs on one shoe? The only thing that had held the carpet up during the collapse was the weight of the people standing round the edge of it. That must have been one good carpet. I met a journalist called David Prince years later who was a resident of Chicago and had been at the gig. He told me that some of his friends and himself considered it to be the greatest gig they'd ever attended, and in some small way it was even a little life changing. High praise indeed from a music journalist who must have seen hundreds of shows since that date. There were one or two added bonuses. First, nobody got hurt. That was a minor miracle that ensured no lawyers were being called on Monday morning. Second, the Daily Star in the UK had sent journalist Rick Skye over to cover the show, and his report led to us stealing the front page with a banner that read "Frankie Sink the Bismark" and a glowing review inside from Rick. It would establish a crazy bond between Frankie and Chicago that would result in more chaos the next time we visited, but let's not go there just yet. The Bismark is still there today, but is now renamed the Cadillac Palace and has been renovated at great expense to bring back the splendour of the Roaring Twenties. Since we'd left New York, Holly had been spending all his time with Wolfgang, who'd joined him on the tour. He'd never socialise with us after shows and would prefer to go out and eat with Wolfgang or hang out at the hotel and do his own thing. This was the second brick out of the Frankie Jenga. Holly felt he needed more rest because 3 consecutive gigs would really strain his voice because of his singing style. In my opinion, his voice would get strained because he never used it enough. When he had to do 3 gigs in a row, his voice would suffer because he wasn't match fit. What do you expect if you turn up to do 1 run through of the set per day in the last week of rehearsal? If I'd played for 1 hour a day for 5 days, then my fingers would be sore if I had to play 3 days on the spin. Practice, hone your craft, get some singing lessons and learn how to protect and project your voice. I can understand that after a gig it's probably not a good idea to go to a nightclub and try to converse with people by having to shout. I've done it myself recently after gigs and have been hoarse the next day. Of course, by all means stay in and get some rest, but the 3-gig rule meant we had many days where our crew was sitting around scratching their bollocks instead of working. That costs money and meant future touring would always be expensive for us. Seeing as I've just mentioned the crew, I feel this would be a good opportunity to give these boys some credit. We spent this tour of America flying together. The small crew and band were generally in the same hotels and sometimes flew on the same planes, so there was a huge gang mentality among us. The English invaders. Whilst we thought we were the big rock stars going out and partying hard, the real stars were the boys in the crew. They did the load in, the gig, breakdown, load out, and then would come out on the lash with us. The difference between the crew and the band was the wake-up call. We had the luxury of a lie-in sometimes, but these guys were often up with the lark and working before we'd even taken our hangover cure or packed our smalls. French John Galliard, Glenn Saggers, Paul Devine, Bruce Bomber Harris, Mike Scarf, Bobby Monitors, Ian Jeffries, and anyone else whose name I can't recall from that first excursion. I salute you. The whole crew was a gang. Wolfgang took the leader of the gang out of the pack. He was Holly's new boyfriend, and as such, Holly had to be the boyfriend he wanted Wolfgang to see. That meant behaving himself and being away from us. Not that we or him were misbehaving, but I don't think hanging out with us would have been Wolfgang's scene, and therefore from now on, whilst Wolfgang was in the picture, it wasn't Holly's scene either. They're still an item and good luck to them. I've no axe to grind with either. My good time spent with Holly far outweigh the bad, and I've never been one to dwell on the negative. Life's too fucking short and we're all in the queue. You could say from this point on you won't really hear a lot about the lead singer as much as the other guys in the band, because he was kind of detached from us from this point forward, and it's safe to assume that in future chapters when I loosely refer to the band, then that doesn't include Holly unless otherwise stated. When I do refer to him, it'll probably be to correct something he's written in his autobiography. If nobody counters what he says, then it becomes part of our history, and whilst I wouldn't claim to speak for the other guys, I hope, or I know, they'll appreciate me righting a few wrongs. From this point on, Holly's version of events is akin to someone looking across at a bus in another lane of the motorway. You can see the people on the bus, but you don't know what's going on, and you can only guess as to their motives, what they're saying, and what they're experiencing. The buses sometimes stop at the same service station, and there's interaction between them and the odd shared experience. But apart from that, they're both on different journeys despite travelling the same road. Next stop on our road was Minneapolis and the First Avenue Club. We were all familiar with the venue after watching Purple Rain and seeing the Little Man and the Time strut their funky stuff on the same boards. Don't remember too much about it apart from the fact that it was really cold and the place was more of a club than a theatre. We were too busy looking forward to getting to the other side of the country and visiting Los Angeles and San Francisco, especially the former where we had 3 sold-out nights to play at the Palace. We passed through Denver on the way to the West Coast. The hotel was called the Park Suite and was another one of those ridiculous affairs where each band member had an apartment to himself. It was nice to experience such luxury and have a dining room and a lounge and a bowl of fruit that would have fed the Denver Broncos at half time, but all we ever saw of these places was the bedroom, and this was through alcohol-blurred eyes after the gig. I do recall having a stroll around when we arrived in Denver and being absolutely knackered after walking about 50 feet up a hill. It was my first experience of altitude. God knows how sportsmen compete in conditions like that, and before you say it, I know I'm no athlete. Our tour manager, Ian Jeffrey, had a Japanese wife and was a lover of all things Japanese, so it was no surprise when we landed in San Francisco and we were staying in Japantown. We were due to play the Kabuki Theatre, and there was a Japanese hotel on the back of it, so travelling to the gig meant a short walk through the hotel. The hotel rooms were a little out of the ordinary, to say the least. Each room had a little Japanese garden in it, consisting of a small portion of the room covered with pure white pebbles and a small tree. The bathrooms were Japanese too, with a huge tub lined with terracotta tiles that looked like a plunge pool in a Turkish bath. There was also a cupboard that revealed a small one-person sauna. The best thing about San Francisco for Mark, Jed and I was meeting our relatives. I was catching up with them after my first visit years before, and Mark and Jed were meeting most of them for the first time. Mark's mum and dad, Josie and Jerry, were in the middle of a visit to California at the time, so it was a big family event for all of us. The gig went well and the after-show party was a big Rogan affair with lots of photographs and reminiscing. To see my extended family in San Francisco was a big buzz for me, and it'd be the last time I saw a couple of the older ones, because on my next visit there I'd be hijacked by the younger generation to avoid what they thought would be boring family dinners. We land in Los Angeles and are driven to the Rock and Roll Hotel, the Sunset Marquee, just off Sunset Boulevard. The tour would finish with sold-out gigs at the Palace, and we already had a small fan base in LA. We had support from Anglophile DJ Richard Blade and hip station KROQ, who'd been playing our album and the singles, so we weren't totally surprised at the interest in the band. We were gigging in the evening, but the days were taken up doing interviews at radio stations or around the swimming pool in the courtyard of the hotel. Mark and I managed to cause a bit of a stink at one of these interviews. We were due to be interviewed by Rick Dees and headed down to Kiss FM to meet this legend of American radio. He hosted the weekly Top 40 Countdown show that was the #1 syndicated show on the airwaves of America, and he also hosted Solid Gold, the Top 40 TV show. We arrive at the station and are met by one of Rick's minions. She informs us that Rick is really busy, so she's going to ask us the questions and Rick will dub them in later before broadcast. Okay, fair enough, let's go in the studio and do it. All the studios are busy, so we're ushered to what can only be described as a janitor's cupboard somewhere down the hall, and the minion produces a tape recorder. It's clear right from the off that this girl has no clue about our music, has done no research about the band, and has no idea who we are, let alone what we do in the band. We suffer in silence and play the game. This is Rick Dees. This is big stuff, so we stay quiet, act professionally, and answer the clueless questions. We come out and complain that the interview seemed like a waste of time. Ron Wisner said, "Don't worry, Rick's a busy guy, it'll all be worth it in the end," and we're whisked off to rival station KROQ. We arrive and are greeted by enthusiastic staff at the door and ushered into the studio for a live interview and a phone-in with our hosts at K-Rock. The beginning of the interview unravels as follows. Hey, welcome to K-Rock, and to our two guests from England, we have Mark and Nasher from UK pop sensation Frankie Goes to Hollywood. Cue raucous applause from those in the studio, about 6 people. Hey guys, how's it going? We hear you just been to see Rick Dees, how did that go? I say, well, we didn't actually meet him. He sent one of his minions to interview us in a cupboard. He couldn't even be bothered to turn up, the tit. Mark chips in with, he's not a tit, Nash. He's a dickhead. A fucking solid gold dickhead. The guys at K-Rock are loving it and goading us to slag him off some more. We didn't realise the rivalry and the difference between K-Rock and Kiss, so happily oblige and give Rick a bit more of an even coating before moving on to the phoning and then playing some tracks and publicising the gigs. However, one guy is not loving it. Ron Wisner's white as a sheet and not very happy. "You can't do that, guys. This guy's industry gold. Slag him and it's finished for you." He spent the next hour trying to organise another interview so that we could apologise. We wouldn't. What can I say? We didn't know the guy, and we felt very insulted at the treatment we'd received at Kiss, so why should we apologise? Ron's talking about taking ads out in the press to say we're sorry. Sorry, Ron, but fuck him. We didn't give a fuck if it was the president himself. Rude is rude, whatever side of the Atlantic you come from. Tony Pope and Bennett Freed try to calm him down, and eventually Ron sees the half-funny side of it. Bennett is trying his best to back Ron and seem disapproving, but secretly he's delighted. He hated Rick Dees, and our outburst was the exact reason he loved the band and had brought us to Ron. We never appeared on Solid Gold. I wonder why. The gigs at the Palace were great and were well received in the press. We were at the top of our game, and the whole show, from the lighting and slide cues to our onstage banter, had all been ironed out to perfection, and we knew it. Our stock was high and people wanted to know us. Paul had credited Gene Kelly on the Pleasure Dome sleeve notes, and some MGM executive saw a photo opportunity and decided we should be invited to meet Gene, who, funnily enough, was just about to release a film called That's Dancing. It was a collection of great dance routines from the movies. We're invited to a private screening at MGM, and Gene meets us at the door of the studio in front of the cameras. Paul brought a Frankie Say t-shirt for Gene, and Gene presented Paul with a t-shirt that said, "Gene says that's dancing." Cheesy as fuck, but nobody was asked. This was Gene Kelly we were meeting. We're ushered into the small private studio and given some popcorn, and we watched Gene's movie. Hardly Mad Max, but still entertaining. Who wouldn't be entertained by watching professional dancers glide across the floor? One of the press crews that were there were from The Sun. The cameraman with them set up a photograph with us throwing popcorn at the camera with Gene in the middle of all of us. We were all laughing and smiling whilst he snapped away, and we were delighted that the folks back home would see us hanging out with Gene in the paper, even if it was the arse rag that was The Sun. This was lesson one for us in dealing with tabloid newspapers. Our positive story meeting Gene Kelly was twisted into a story that said we'd taken the piss out of Gene, thrown popcorn at him, and generally made arses out of ourselves, insulting him and the studio executives. Who'd do that? The guy was a lovely old pensioner, and despite the fact we loved a wind-up, we'd never have behaved like that when meeting such a legend. We were kids, but we all knew about Gene, and even the most macho would have to have a sneaking admiration for his craft and his nimble feet. Happily, the scum from The Sun were not present when we got to meet another legend of Hollywood, albeit a legend of the small screen. After one of the shows at the Palace, we get changed and walk into the green room, and who's standing there? I'll give you the clue. Hey. That was a really shit Fonz impression. The coolest man on the planet, Mr. Henry Winkler, better known as the Fonz, had come to the show with his kids who were big Frankie fans. What is cooler than the Fonz than actually meeting him and finding out what a lovely guy he was? He was difficult to spot as he was sporting a full beard and was a lot shorter than you would imagine Fonzie to be. He said he enjoyed the show, but probably not as much as we had all enjoyed Happy Days when we were growing up. Our tour was finished and we had a couple of days off in LA before we were due to head home. We thought we had our live show sorted, but we had an opportunity to see a real showman before we left American shores, as the Jacksons' Victory Tour was about to roll into town, and due to Ron's connection with Michael, we were going to have backstage access and maybe get to meet the great man himself. They were winding up their record-breaking tour the same time as ourselves, but I think they made a bit more money than we did. In the backstage preamble, I was introduced to Randy Jackson. I guess one Jackson is better than none. And also met producer genius Quincy Jones. I told Quincy about the first time we heard some of the tracks from Thriller in the back of our van and how much we'd loved it. He said thanks, but I could tell he really wasn't arsed. We were amongst 55,000 punters crammed into Dodgers Stadium to see them play on their adopted home turf. We would leave a day later to try and conquer our own home turf and make our first appearances on British soil since our two #1 records. After 3 sellout shows in LA, we were flying back for Christmas in Liverpool, and another 3 sold out shows at the Royal Court. 1984, what we considered to be the year of Frankie, was going to terminate at home. We were primed and couldn't wait.